Pennington, and I'm joined by Ryan Bailey over in Ireland. Hello, Ryan.
Morning, John.
Now, we're just going to look back on Ireland's recent tour of the West Indies, of course. And Ryan, it's fair to say that it was a tour that didn't start too well, both on and off the pitch, but sort of maybe grew to a bit more of a crescendo and closed reasonably strongly. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, it was a funny tour in that sort of sense because, as you mentioned, it got off to a sort of a difficult start. In the Nagico Super 50, they experienced they had a bit rusty after the winter break, but they came back strongly against the West Indies, as we all know. And I think Phil Simmons, before they went out, he insisted that those were the games they were looking to perform in, and they certainly did. Even though they drew the 2020 series 1-all, they'd be extremely disappointed not to have won that. And then I suppose they didn't really perform in the ODI. Even though the margin of victory for the West Indies suggests that it was a closer match, Ireland were never really in it, and they were sort of on the back foot for the majority. They fought back as they usually do under Phil Simmons, but they were never really in that. But there's plenty of positives to take from the 4 weeks they were over there, and now all preparations lead to Bangladesh in a couple of weeks' time.
Absolutely. A lot of focus in particular, because we've done a hotspot already reviewing their performance in the Nagico Super 50s. The first 2020 equally won by 6 wickets. I mean, Ed Joyce really played the starring role there, didn't they? But the bowlers equally did a superb job to restrict West Indies to a low score.
Yeah, it was sort of like the archetypal Irish victory that they've had over the past few years. They bowled first on a sort of a sticky wicket. In terms of run scoring, they fielded brilliantly, as we've come to expect with them. And they bowled their nagging line of lengths, and the West Indies were, just like Ireland were in the Super 50, they were caught cold, really. It was their first international game of the summer. The likes of Gale, Samuels were returning from injury, so they weren't particularly fresh, and it showed. And Ireland really took advantage of that. But as you said, the bowling in particular during the Super 50 was a bit criticised because they lacked the depth. With Trent Johnson got retired now, so they stood up. Especially Alex Cusack, obviously he got most of the plaudits, but the other bowlers, did their job. The likes of Tim Murtagh, who's sort of the cog on the wheels, so to speak, in the Irish bowling attack now that Trent Johnson's retired. He feels that he needs to step up, and so far he has done, in fairness to him. But then the batting as well, Ireland have been sort of susceptible to, batting collapses in the past against the big teams when they have a chance of winning. But, Ed Joyce coming back into the side after missing the Super 50, he was just superb, and he sort of gives that, that presence at the top of the order that Ireland mightn't necessarily have otherwise. He's so calm, and his quality, he uses quality from the moment he comes into the crease, just his swagger about him, and he guided them home there. But there was important innings as well by the likes of Gary Wilson, who's sort of overlooked at times. He's an equally important part of that batting lineup as well. But it was a great victory for Ireland, and a lot of people were saying, it was a massive shock and an upset. But Ireland have come. At the end of the day, Ireland go out to beat every side they can, and they might pull it off once or twice every so often. But I don't necessarily think it was that much of a shock, given the circumstances and given where the West Indies were coming from. I know in the Caribbean the West Indies team was heavily criticised for the defeat, and I think one of the Jamaican Cricket Board members, was particularly critical of the team and saying that how can they lose to a team like Ireland on their own patch. And also Ireland had played 2 2020 warm-up games before the first 2020 against the Trinidad and Tobago B team. And they had won one of those games and then lost the other, and it was made clear by the officials in the West Indies that Ireland had lost to a Trinidad and Tobago B team, and how can the 2020 holders go out and lose to Ireland in such criminal circumstances. So a lot of scrutiny was put on the West Indies, but I think a lot of credit has to go to Ireland and the way they went about their business. And it was great to see, because the amount of social media coverage they got, and a lot of people were were congratulating them and other people were applauding their efforts. And it's such a pity that they couldn't get over the line a couple of days later in the second one because they thoroughly deserved it. The second one was a bit disappointing in terms of they couldn't get over the line, and that sort of hampered Ireland in the last few months. They had Pakistan on the ropes in Dublin last May, and then they had England on the ropes in September in Malahide, and they just couldn't get over the line. They couldn't execute their skills, and it sort of was the same in Jamaica on Friday when they lost the second 2020, when they really should have won a chasing 98 to win. They were in a great position, although the wicket was a bit slow and it was a bit difficult, and the likes of Son and Ryan were bowling on it. Ireland just never really seemed to get going, and they.
So, Ryan, if we can just sort of look back on the first 2020 international, a wonderful victory for Ireland, of course, really kept it tight with the bowling, and then Ed Joyce played a superb innings, and Kevin O'Brien played his part at the end as well, with a couple of really important boundaries.
Yeah, if you look back on them, sort of like the archetypal Irish victory over the past 2 years, as you said, they bowled and fielded fantastically, sort of what we've become used to Ireland doing that in the past few years, and then Ed Joyce and Kevin O'Brien got them over the line, but it was a victory obviously that drew the series for them, but much more than that, it gives them massive confidence heading into the World 2020, and we everyone knows the sort of struggles they had in the Super 50 before, and the team were never short of confidence. But I suppose after suffering two defeats like they did in the Super 50, there might have been a few question marks over the batting, and the bowling wasn't great then in the Super 50 either. But in terms of the win, you couldn't have asked for anything more from the bowlers to start off with. We've become used to sort of Ireland hustling and harrying the opposition with their nagging line of lengths, and that's exactly what they did. Alex Cusack, of course, really stood out with the ball. And then with the bat, Ed Joyce coming back from a rest period, he missed the Super 50, and he just oozes class at the top of the order. He sort of gives Ireland that stability and confidence that everyone can sort of play around him. He can play the lead role. And with Porterfield and Sterling, the openers, not really having the best of times, it was sort of important that Joyce came back, got some runs, but more importantly, time in the middle ahead of the World T20. Because even though he's 35, and even though he's seen maybe as sort of a longer term player, longer format player, he's still a massive part in Ireland's 2020 plans, because he is that sort of the head and shoulders above everyone else in the Irish batting lineup. So it was massive for him, and he just really showed his importance to the team in that innings alone.
And if we look back at the second 2020 international, I mean, sometimes low-scoring games can be quite exciting, and this was in its own way. But again, it was a very sticky pitch, a very low score put on the board by the West Indies, and Ireland not quite able to. I think the wicket of Gary Wilson in the run chase was a really pivotal moment, because with him in there scoring 40 odd, Ireland still had a chance, didn't they?
Yeah, generally low scoring matches sort of tend to suit Ireland in a way. They bowl first, bowl the opposition out, or keep them to a low score, and then chase the runs down because they don't have to, go to high tempo. Unfortunately, that didn't really materialise last Friday. As we said, they stuck to their. William Porterfield won the toss again, and on the Sabina Park wicket, which was, as we said, low, sticky, difficult to play, turning quite a bit. He had no hesitation but to bowl first, and if they probably didn't think things could get better from the first one, and they did. The West Indies were sort of all over the place, caught cold by Ireland. It was only their second game of the summer. Sterling in particular is quite worrying. Like, neither of them scored any runs in the Caribbean, and even, you know, Porterfield, it was actually, just before we move on to the one-day international we're going to talk about in a few minutes, you know, he got a few runs in that, but apart from that, he just looks completely out of form, and it is really worrying, especially going into the World T20, that neither of those batsmen are in any sorts of form. But you know, that can't be said about the middle order, who've really stood up. We've spoken about Joyce, as you mentioned. Gary Wilson is really coming into his own in the middle order. He's really found a position that he can find some runs at, and consistency. You know, he's been all over the order in recent years. He's been sort of playing that all-rounder role, but he can now call that number 5 position, or number 4, depending on where Phil Simmons wants him to bat his own. And you know, Niall O'Brien as well. He's always there and thereabouts. And as we mentioned, Kevin O'Brien is quite lethal at the end of any inning. So you know, it was a really positive couple of games for Ireland heading into Bangladesh, but there is a couple of question marks still hanging over the side and the makeup of the side, and different individual players' form. So you know, the next few weeks would be pretty crucial for them in terms of preparing and finalising all that.
And if we look at the one-day international, on the face of it, a 4-wicket win for the West Indies, it might sort of portray the picture that it was a bit close, but I suppose you could say that the West Indies pretty much got their own back maybe for the 2020 defeat, and Ireland were perhaps not quite strong enough on the day to really push them as close as they might, losing early wickets, and they didn't really sort of come back from that.
Yeah, it was a 4-wicket win, and we'll go down in the scorebook and as a 4-wicket win. But in terms of, you know, there was a lot different how the game played. Ireland were on the back foot for the majority of the game. Batting first, bowling first. There was no real surprise in that.
Carry on, Ryan.
So yeah, so Ireland batting first. You know, it's not something they've done massively in the past against the bigger nations. They sort of tend to try to bowl first, but William Porterfield obviously felt that, you know, they needed the opportunity to bat first, that sort of practice. And you know, it was, apart from Sterling's early wicket, it was a decent start, but it sort of just typified Porterfield's form, his individual luck, that he had hit 2 sixes in the over off Miguel Cummins on debut, and he then gets out to a ball down the leg side, caught behind off his glove. So it sort of just typified his luck, and that sort of turned it a bit. You know, Joyce couldn't really get going, and Niall O'Brien came in, stuck about for a bit. You know, nudged it around the place as he usually does. But in terms of gaining momentum, it was all a bit sticky for Ireland, and they've sort of shown that as well in the Super 50, that they have sort of forgotten how to bat in the 50-over format. You know, before Christmas, they had the World T20 qualifiers, and that was about 10, 12 games of 2020 cricket. And then they had the Intercontinental Cup final. So their last 50-over game before January was actually way back in September against England in Malahide. So, you know, they're sort of short of match practice in the 50-over, and it sort of showed in terms of the batting. They didn't really know how to go about it. They either started off like it was a 4-day game or a 5-day game, or they started off like it was a 2020, and there was no real consistency there and accumulating runs like we've seen them do in the past. So they struggled with the bat, but in terms of, they still got up to past 200, so that's something to bowl at. But as soon as Dwayne Smith started coming out and playing aggressively, the game was sort of taken away from Ireland. And as we said before, despite some rallying in the middle overs and a couple of wickets for Stuart Thompson and George Dockrell, they were never really in the game, and it was a pity because it sort of ended the tour on a low note and a disappointing end to a pretty good tour for Ireland. But I suppose defeats can be more instructive than victories, and for Phil Simmons, he'll learn a lot from that 50-over game, because they've made it clear, Ireland, that their preparations is really gearing up now towards the 2015 50-over World Cup, and that's what their sort of schedule is going to be for the next year or so. You know, they've got a couple of ODIs against Sri Lanka coming up, and then they've got a couple of ODIs actually against Sri Lanka A during the summer as well in Dublin. So it's really gearing up towards the 50 over World Cup, and on the evidence of the Caribbean tour, I think they've a good bit of work to do. But I suppose of course, it's not an obstacle, the World T20. But once they get over that, I think they'll be just all gun ho now for the 50 over and really concentrating on honing in on their skills for that.
Absolutely, and all teams I think will be as well. Now, if we look ahead to the ICC World 2020, a bit different this time around because Ireland have got to sort of go through a pre-qualifying tournament. You've mentioned the form of Porterfield and Sterling is a potential concern, but where do you think they are in terms of confidence going in? You've said they've played a lot of 2020 cricket over the last few months, and what other sort of pointers are you sort of looking ahead to as the tournament sort of gets underway in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, it's a funny one because the expansion of the World 2020 has meant that Ireland, as you said, are in this initial group stage, and one defeat in their opening game could prove fatal. Really, there's not much margin for error in terms of qualifying. And the way the cricketing public here in Ireland at the moment is, they sort of know that there's a team in the World Cup, but they don't really understand. They won't really come to terms with the fact that there's a new group stage, and a lot of people will just read it in their newspaper.
Looks like Ryan's just disappeared for the moment. We'll wait for him to come back. It's a fascinating point he's making there about how perhaps people are aware that Ireland, Hong Kong, Zimbabwe, Bangladesh are in the World 2020, but technically they're not in the final stages yet. They've still got to go through this sort of pre-qualifying, which is a new thing this year. They've expanded the tournament to 16 teams, but of course there's only 8 of those teams that have actually qualified as of right. So I think Ryan's back with us now. So just carry on that point, Ryan. It's absolutely fascinating that people are aware maybe that teams are in the World Cup, but they're not fully qualified yet, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. The cricketing public here in Ireland is growing massively, growing by every game. But people wouldn't be fanatical about it. People wouldn't know the ins and outs. So once they know they're in the World Cup, they just feel that they're in the World Cup, and they have been where they were in 2007 when they beat the West Indies, in 2011 when they beat England. So there is a lot of pressure on the Irish team, because suddenly if they go out and they lose to Holland, or they lose to Zimbabwe or Hong Kong in this initial stage, and they don't qualify for the Super 8 or the Super 10 with all the bigger nations, then there's suddenly a question of failure, and they haven't qualified for where they've got before. And it's a bit, they're sort of on a lose-lose situation, because it's an extremely difficult group stage to get through. Zimbabwe are a test-playing nation. Holland are, Ireland should beat Holland, but 2020, anything can happen on the day. And Hong Kong are one of these teams that could cause an upset. So, Ireland will be confident that they can get through. They should really get through. I suppose it's sort of between them and Zimbabwe, but it will be extremely disappointing if they don't get through, and sort of not seen as a failure, but sort of maybe a setback if they don't qualify and rub shoulders with the bigger teams.
Just a final point, Ryan, and I'm going to put you on the spot here maybe. I'm not sure, have Ireland ever played Zimbabwe in a 2020 International, and if so, what was the result? I can't remember them playing each other.
No, I don't think they have actually. They played Bangladesh a good few times in 2020 games, most recently in Belfast a couple of years ago, and that was a 3-game series, and they actually lost 3-0. So I don't think they've actually played Zimbabwe since the 2007 World Cup, when they were in the group stages with them. So that should be interesting, and Zimbabwe is sort of a lot to prove themselves as well. And with these new ICC changes as well, the sort of spotlight is on the sort of the top tier associates in terms of Ireland, and then the likes of Zimbabwe and Bangladesh. So it's a place for fascinating viewing when it does come around. But it's Ireland are under a bit of pressure to really go out there and succeed and qualify for the Super 10 stages.
They certainly are. Ryan, thank you very much for your time today.
No problem at all.
And thank you for watching Hotspot. Don't forget, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and you'll get notifications whenever we publish new videos. Lots of exclusive we've got coming up with legends of the game, as well as further hotspots as the Asia Cup and the ICC World Twenty20 get underway and continue, of course. So from me, John Pennington, thank you very much for watching, and goodbye for now.